welcome, and thank you for joining today's webinar on Financial and Prudential Standards. My name is Liz Hefren-Webb. I'm the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner, and I'm chairing today's webinar. I would first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that acknowledgement and respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people watching today. I'm joining you from Ngunnawal country. Before I start the discussion, I'll just do a quick bit of housekeeping. After we hear from the panel, there'll be time for a Q&A session, and you can ask questions at any time. Just use the question box via the live Q&A tab, which should be visible on your screen. We also have a short survey for you to complete at the end of today's webinar to provide us with feedback on today's event. Just stay online and a survey will pop up on screen. It's only short and your feedback is important to us, both in determining future topics, but also understanding the value of the topics we're discussing today. Today's webinar will also be recorded and published on our website in the next couple of days. Everyone who registered for today's session will be sent a link to the recording as soon as it's available. As you may know, I commenced as the new Commissioner for Aged Care Quality and Safety in late January, replacing Commissioner Janet Anderson. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge Janet's service over the last 6 years and the amazing job she has done in establishing the Commission. The purpose of today's webinar is to talk about the proposed new Financial and Prudential Standards under the new Aged Care Act, which we published on our website yesterday. We want to ensure you all have the information you need to be able to provide feedback, which will shape the final version of the standards. As I've only been with the Commission for just on a month, this is the first webinar I have been involved in. So it's also the first opportunity I've had to speak directly to the sector and other interested groups. I'm going to therefore take the opportunity just to give you a brief history of my background and what I hope to achieve in this role over the next few years. So I come to you as a nearly 30-year veteran of the Australian Public Service. I worked across a range of social policy areas in that time and a range of social policy departments. I've worked on issues like disability, aged care reform. I've worked on domestic violence issues, a lot of work in First Nations policy, and a range of other matters. My most recent position was as Deputy Secretary Social Policy in the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, where I was lucky enough to work on the aged care reforms from the point of view of. I'm really looking forward to getting to know you all. I have had some engagement with some members of the sector and a number of consumer representatives already, but I am really conscious I have a lot to learn. I'm really committed to making sure I build on the great work that's been done by Janet and all of the staff here at the Commission to make us a best practice regulator, ensure their safety. That's probably enough for me. I'm sure you want to actually get on and discuss the standards. So under the new Aged Care Act, the Commission is responsible in consultation with the Department for developing this new set of Financial and Prudential Standards, which will come into effect from the 1st of July 2025. Our role in setting and monitoring provider compliance with the Financial and Prudential Standards complements all the other work the Commission does to ensure providers deliver sustainable, high-quality, safe care. The new standards expand on the current prudential standards, which previously focused on the management and protection of refundable deposits. The standards seek to improve the financial management of providers, ensuring they have the appropriate systems in place to maintain financial viability. By doing so, they aim to prevent financial issues from adversely affecting continuity of care or quality of care delivery, as well as a provider's ability to refund accommodation deposits when they become due. I recognise that this is a small part of a big reform agenda, so I'm pleased to see that so many of you have taken the trouble to spend this time hearing about the standards. Our hope is that by the end of the webinar, you will be clear about what's staying the same and what you need to prepare for, along with understanding about how we intend to regulate against the standards. To assist with that, I have the following people joining me today. Peter Edwards, Acting Deputy Commissioner, Regulatory Operations. Paul Heinemann, Acting Executive Director, Compliance Management. Rochelle Stanix, Director of Financial and Prudential Supervision. And Ellie Osborne, Director of Prudential Compliance and Proactive Monitoring. We will aim to get through the presentation component of the webinar with about 20 minutes left over to answer your questions. So please use the chat function to send through your questions, and we will aim to get to as many as we can in the time we have. I'll now hand over to Peter Edwards, who's been leading the group that has been working on the development of the standards. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Liz, and thank you to so many of you who have joined, because this is an important part of the bigger reform. I'll kick off with a bit more context about why the Financial Prudential Standards are changing. The Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety recognised that the delivery of safe, quality care requires providers to manage a wide range of operational risks, including financial risks that can impact care delivery, as well as their capacity to appropriately manage refundable deposits that many residential providers hold. In response to those findings, responsibility for regulation of prudential standards transferred to the Commission in 2020, followed by monitoring of provider level viability in 2023 from the Department of Health and Aged Care. Since then, the new Aged Care Act has given the Commissioner, as Liz said, the power to set financial and prudential standards. So in preparation for that, we have been working closely with our colleagues at the department to develop the standards we are now consulting on. Shortly, we'll walk you through the detail of the new standards. However, I will take this opportunity to explain the benefit of having financial and prudential risks managed alongside concerns we might have about quality and safety of care. That benefit being that if it has enabled us to intervene earlier when we see signs of emerging financial problems, that if left untreated, could impact quality and safety of care delivery. In the last couple of years, there have been many cases where our ability to intervene and work with the provider to strengthen their financial governance has helped avoid further deterioration in a provider's financial position, mitigating the risk of that provider needing to make expenditure decisions that could have a negative impact on the quality of service delivery. In addition to that, having a collective view of financial as well as quality and safety risks has also given the Commission a more complete picture of operational issues that may be barriers to a provider investing in required corrective action. This enables us to then intervene in a way that supports sustainable improvement that keeps people who are relying on the provider's services safe and well cared for. So, it is with the older person at the centre of our planning that we have developed these standards. I'll now hand over to Paul and I'll rejoin you at the end for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And again, a big thank you to all you for joining us today. Peter, that was a really valuable recap on both the drivers for change, but also on the objectives of the new standards. I would now like to spend some time providing an overview of both what is proposed to change, but also what will remain the same. One of our key objectives in the development of the new standards was to consolidate, where appropriate, similar types of obligations in the legislation. As such, the existing requirements under the current records standard and disclosure standard are being drafted separately for inclusion in the rules. This allows these obligations to be aligned with other similar reporting and disclosure requirements. It is proposed that the new standards will comprise the following: the Financial and Prudential Management Standard, the Investment Standard, and the liquidity standard. Now, I'll now explain the changes to which providers the new standards are proposed to apply to. The current prudential standards only apply to residential providers that hold refundable deposits. And as Peter mentioned, the intention of these standards is broader than just refundable accommodation deposits. Primarily, it is about the older Australian and ensuring they receive quality care. Now, under the new Act, the application of the standards will broaden as the financial and prudential risk is a significant factor for providers to deliver high quality care, regardless of if they hold refundable deposits or not. Now, the Financial and Prudential Management Standard will apply to all non-government, residential and home care service providers. The Investment and Liquidity Standards will apply to all non-government residential providers. Government-operated providers, such as those run by local councils, are not subject to these standards, as is currently the case. Now, the following table should help visualise who each of the standards will apply to. Now, here you can see the application of each of those, the three proposed standards against the different provider registration categories. Now, as I've said, and you'll be able to see, the Financial and Prudential Management Standard will apply to all registered providers in categories 4, 5 and 6 that are not government or local government entities. The Investment Standard and Liquidity Standard, as stated, will apply to residential care providers that are providing funded aged care services in an approved residential care home that are not government or local government entities. Now I'll hand over to Ellie, who will take you through each of those proposed three standards in detail. Thank you, Ellie.
Thanks, Paul. All right, let's look a little bit deeper into the standards themselves. So firstly, we have the Financial and Prudential Management Standard. And as you've just seen on the last slide, this standard will apply to all non-government residential and home care service providers that are registered in categories 4, 5 and 6. The standard requires providers to have governance systems and strategies in place to ensure that the provider is managed in a financially sound way. Governance systems and strategies must enable fair financial and prudential decisions that prioritise quality of care. So the Financial and Prudential Management System aims to achieve two things. Firstly, to ensure the financial viability and sustainability of the provider, and secondly, to ensure that refundable deposits are managed in accordance with the Act. So your financial management system must set out the roles of persons in the system, including their accountabilities and responsibilities, enable the provider to monitor and control any delegation or outsourcing of those responsibilities, include internal reporting mechanisms to enable the provider to effectively monitor and control the system, and enable you to detect, record, and respond to any failure to comply with that system. So from a compliance perspective, when we're looking at a provider's financial management system, we would typically look to see that they have written policies and procedures in place, documentation outlining financial governance responsibilities, regular reports that show governing body oversight and ongoing improvements, and position descriptions that clearly define roles and accountabilities. But we don't want you to just put these systems in place and forget about them. So certainly not a case of setting and forgetting. The system must be regularly reviewed to ensure its effectiveness, at least once in each financial year and at other key points as required. Next, we have the Investment Standard. Again, this will apply to all non-government residential care providers. The standard requires a registered provider to ensure the adoption of sound practices in relation to the selection, management, and monitoring of their investments, including when they're investing refundable deposit monies. There are three main requirements under this standard. So firstly, the provider must implement and maintain a written investment management strategy, or an IMS. Secondly, the provider must ensure that investment of refundable deposits is in accordance with that strategy. And finally, the provider must regularly review and improve the effectiveness of its IMS. So the standard is very clear about what must be included in that investment management strategy. It must set out your investment objectives and a strategy for achieving those objectives. the asset classes that the provider may invest in and investment limits for each of those asset classes, the accountabilities, responsibilities, and skills required of those operating under the strategy, how the governing body monitors and controls any delegation of responsibilities, and finally, internal reporting mechanisms, including the scope, manner, frequency, and methods for reporting to the governing body. And just like I mentioned for your financial and prudential management system, the IMS must be regularly reviewed and updated, including where there are changes to investment objectives, asset classes, or investment limits, where there are changes to the accountabilities, responsibilities, or skills and experience required of those with responsibility under the strategy, or where new or emerging risks are identified. And last but definitely not least, we have the liquidity standard. So the new liquidity standard will apply to all non-government residential care providers, and that's whether they hold refundable deposits or not. So as Paul mentioned earlier, the scope is a little bit broader, recognising the other risks that we're trying to manage. Under this standard, a provider must ensure the sound management of their liquidity and liquidity risks. Under this standard, there are two key requirements. Firstly, providers must maintain enough liquidity to meet their financial obligations as they're due. And secondly, providers must have a written liquidity management strategy, or an LMS. So what do we mean when we talk about having sufficient liquidity? Sufficient liquidity means that providers will remain financially viable and can fund activities with stable sources of income on an ongoing basis. It means they can deliver safe and quality funded aged care services to individuals, can meet their obligations as they fall due, and can refund in accordance with the Act any refundable deposit balances expected to fall due in the following 12 months. The new standard sets a minimum liquidity threshold for providers to comply with. It requires residential providers to hold 35% of their cash expenses, and where they hold refundable deposits, they're required to hold 10% of the refundable deposit liabilities. I'll note here that this is a minimum value that providers should always hold, but providers may decide that they should hold more than this amount based on an assessment of their own specific organisational risks. In coming up with this threshold, the Commission has done extensive analysis to assess the financial resilience of aged care providers against both negative economic conditions and market shocks. This included working with actuarial experts on modelling to determine the 35 and 10 threshold. So that's a level that will ensure that the majority of providers are able to manage short-term financial stress scenarios. And I will just note here that this, separate to the liquidity standard, there are still requirements for providers relating to the use of refundable deposits. So this liquidity standard and that 10% threshold for refundable deposit liabilities doesn't override the obligations that providers have to hold refundable deposits that they haven't spent on permitted uses. In addition to complying with the minimum liquidity amount, providers will still need a written liquidity management strategy as they do now. As you can see in the slides there, the LMS must set out a number of different factors. So I'll highlight a couple of those in particular. The LMS must set out the amount needed to meet the minimum liquidity amount. So as I mentioned earlier, that 35 and 10 threshold is the minimum amount that providers must hold, but you may decide that you should hold more than that based on an assessment of your own operational risks. The LMS must also set out the forms of liquidity to be kept, the organisation's sources of income and how cash flow will be monitored, and the accountabilities and responsibilities for supporting the maintenance of the liquidity management strategy. Your LMS should also detail the factors that you've considered in developing that strategy, which might include considering your organisation's current state, for example, size and number of residents, current finances and access to financing, changing market and industry conditions, contingency planning, and any strategic goals and plans for growth sustainability. And if you don't currently have the means to achieve the minimum liquidity amount, your LMS should detail the steps that you will take and the timeframe to get there. To assist you in meeting this new requirement, we've developed a liquidity calculator, which is a downloadable tool for providers to use to calculate their minimum liquidity requirement each quarter. This is up on the Commission website now, so I would certainly encourage people to take a look at it and see how it might assist you in preparing for the new liquidity threshold. Our financial supervision section is already identifying and working with providers that are at risk of not meeting this prescribed minimum liquidity amount. So I'll hand over to my colleague Rochelle now, who manages that section, and she'll talk you through our approach to monitoring and reviewing financial viability and compliance with the standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. I will talk about the role that my team plays in supporting providers that have financial viability challenges, as I suspect some providers listening in today will be concerned about what happens if they think they are likely to fall under the new liquidity threshold. In preparation for a minimum liquidity threshold being set, we've been doing a few things to help us identify providers that would benefit from working with us. This has involved, amongst other things, the development of tools we use internally to track emerging financial risks for providers. These tools not only help us to detect providers that would benefit from contact with us before they become a potential compliance risk, but they also help us understand where there might be specific issues for different parts of the sector. That then helps us tailor guidance that will support different groups to improve their overall financial governance. Where we do engage with the provider directly, our focus is on helping them improve their financial governance, including building more robust cash flow forecasting to better manage their liquidity risks. What this means is that those providers that have been under the threshold will have already been part of our provider engagement and monitoring program. An example of one of these tools is the liquidity dashboard that you can see here on this slide. I thought it would be useful to show you a tool like this, as it is one of the ways we use the data that providers submit to understand and identify risk. We don't do this to identify providers in order to take compliance action against them. Rather, it's to help us identify financial and prudential risk before it leads to a non-compliance that has the potential to cause harm. This is one example of the Commission's preventative regulatory approach, as it involves us working proactively rather than reactively in response to something that has already happened. The introduction of the minimum liquidity threshold will assist some of our work in this area, as it will be the first time providers will have a minimum target that governing bodies can use to help them oversee a key financial risk.
The point that Rochelle was making is that all Australians should be confident that aged care organisations have strong financial governance systems in place to enable them to continue to operate and deliver safe quality aged care services. An important part of a strong financial governance system is effective management of liquidity. Having sufficient liquidity means that an organisation has access to reliable sources of cash and cash equivalents to meet payments that when they become due. For many aged care providers, this also means an ability to refund refundable accommodation deposits. Under the new liquidity standard, registered providers must keep enough liquidity to meet their financial needs as they become due and have a strong strategy to manage liquidity risk. Where providers have less than the prescribed minimum liquidity amount, we will work with them to understand why they are not meeting the standard and whether they have strategies to manage the financial risks that the liquidity standard is designed to address. Where providers don't have strategies to address those risks, we'll expect the provider to develop a strategy and show evidence of their plan to meet the prescribed minimum liquidity amount. Where providers are willing to work closely with us, we'll provide guidance and support in relation to regulatory requirements. As mentioned, when the Commission is concerned that a provider isn't meeting their obligations under the Financial and Prudential Standard, we'll contact them directly. It will only be where providers fail to demonstrate they are taking their obligations seriously and do not have a suitable remediation plan in place that we will consider using regulatory tools to compel action. Our monitoring and detection of liquidity risk is dependent on quarterly financial data. We are aware that there will be some providers that won't appear to meet the liquidity threshold because they have strategies in place to manage liquidity through third-party arrangements that aren't reported in their quarterly financial reports. In these cases, the Commission may seek information about those arrangements, and if we are satisfied that they are suitably robust, we may consider placing a condition on the provider's registration to ensure they report any changes in those arrangements. Before I move on from this topic, I want to reinforce that in situations where the registered provider is not directly holding sufficient liquidity, we will be looking very closely at the adequacy of those alternative arrangements, as we will need to see evidence that gives us assurance that those arrangements are sufficient to meet the minimum liquidity threshold. I say that as we do come across some complex business structures in the aged care sector where related party arrangements would need to be strengthened in favour of the registered provider to satisfy the standard. There is a raft of educational materials to help you understand and apply the standards. These include an updated Financial and Prudential Standards webpage, updated and new fact sheets, downloadable liquidity calculator tool, updated and new e-learning modules, and communication materials specifically targeting providers that will be included for the first time, particularly home service providers in categories 4 and 5, and residential providers that do not currently hold refundable deposits. Now, we're now at the point where we've given you all the information and hopefully it's setting the scene for you, but we would obviously keen for you to also look at the materials that have been released with the along with the standards, as we really do want people to review the guidelines and give us feedback, because we will use that feedback to improve how we provide the guidance we provide, but also it may result in some fine-tuning of the final version of the standards. So you can use the QR code on the screen or simply by visiting the consultation page on the website to provide that feedback. I'm pleased that we have had quite a large number of questions that were pre-lodged, which we will work our way through, and there have also been some questions that have been put into the chat during the presentation. So we're going to work through those shortly. But before I hand back over to Liz, who's going to facilitate that, please note that the Financial and Prudential Standards remain in draft, as will the guidance. And in that information, we have used the terms deposited amount and deposited amount balances. Now, these terms should not be taken as final, as they may be changed to align with other sections of the rules which are currently still being drafted. For the purposes of the consultation period, they should be taken to mean all refundable deposits taken under the Aged Care Act 1997, including refundable deposits, refundable accommodation deposits, and accommodation bonds and entry contributions. Further advice will be provided and updates made to all guidance material once these terms are finalised as required. So now I'll hand back to Liz, and we'll work our way through the questions that we've received. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Peter. Thanks, everybody, and apologies for the sound issues that we had. Hopefully we have covered the material, but as we said, there'll be lots of material coming up on the website. There's just one question that's directed to me that's come in, so I might just deal with that, and then the rest of it I think we'll be passing to the team to answer. One questioner has asked, I'm interested to know if you're willing to engage with grassroots group Aged Care Reform Now, please. I'm happy to commit to engaging with you. So please just reach out to my office and we will make a time to catch up. All right, I'll now go to the questions. So the first one we have received relates to NAPSI-FACTS, which is the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Flexible Aged Care Program, and it's do the standards apply to NAPSI-FACTS? And I might go to Paul to answer this one.
Excellent. Thank you, Liz. And thanks for the question. As Liz said, NAPSI-FACT refers to National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Flexible Aged Care Program, and it's a program that funds aged care services to meet the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, allowing them to remain close to home and community. Now, whilst we consider it being equally important for NAPSI-FACT providers to be financially stable and to provide continuity of care, this is something that we are continuing to work with the Department of Health and Aged Care in relation to what the appropriate timing is for the application of the liquidity and investment standards for NAPSI-FACT providers. So as we work through those policy considerations and receive feedback through the stakeholder cohorts, we will communicate out through our consultation page the policy position around NAPSI-FACT. Just while we're talking about groups of providers, for multi-purpose services providers, which is a program that combines Australian government funding for aged care services with state and territory health services. MPS providers are generally of a government nature, but not always. So government organisations that are MPS providers will not be subject to the standards. As we mentioned, government providers, including local government authorities, are excluded from the standards. But if you are a non-government MPS provider, then the standards will apply. Now, of course, as we've mentioned, we will be reaching out to groups that are new to the standards, and we'll be looking to engage with these groups to ensure that you understand and are supported to meet the new requirements. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks so much, Paul. The next question I might pass to Peter. It's what difference will these changes make for consumers?
Look, thanks, Liz, and it's a good question. And as I said in the presentation, or hopefully we made it sufficiently clear during the presentation, the development of these standards we've developed them with people who rely on aged care services as the key consideration, and that's because people who use aged care services, particularly in what will become registration categories 4, 5 and 6, are dependent on the provider managing the organisation in a way that keeps it financially viable, so that services that people need are properly funded and the risk of sudden unplanned closure is avoided at all costs. If those things are not managed well, it impacts quality and safety and accessibility of care. And we know that causes unnecessary hardship to people at a very vulnerable time in their life. In addition to that, many people living in residential care have deposited reasonably large amounts of money with the provider, and that money must be carefully managed so it's repaid when due. So it's really, Liz, that the management of those types of risks that adversely impact people who rely on aged care services. The standards are designed to ensure a provider is managing.
Thanks so much, Peter. I might go back to Paul for the next one, which is coming through in the questions online as well, which is why are home care providers now being included? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Look, I think we've talked about the fact that there's shared risk, and the intention of the standards is to support and ensure providers are financially viable and sustainable, because as has been mentioned in the presentation, poor financial positions do tend to manifest in poor quality of care outcomes. And as was a finding of the Royal Commission, the same risk exists in both parts of our regulated community. And therefore, the broadening of the standards and the scope of the standards to home care providers is there to ensure that those same risks are being managed. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks so much, Paul. The next question I might pass to Ellie. So, given the size and number of all these changes expected, will you be giving any leniency around regulating the new financial and prudential standards to allow the providers within the sector to transition?
Thanks, Liz. And that's a really good question. I'll start by saying that these changes build on existing good practices within the sector. So as we've seen when we walk through the standards, there are some similarities to what residential providers with refundable deposits are dealing with now, but certainly my team, my section engages with quite a number of providers in the prudential space already. And we've seen that most organisations already have good systems, policies and procedures in place to meet their financial and prudential obligations. And a large majority of providers already exceed the minimum liquidity amount that must be held. So we're starting from a good position. Where providers are not meeting obligations under the new standards, the Commission applies a proportionate risk-based approach to compliance, and that's the same as we do now. So in practice, that means that where we see non-compliance, but we also see evidence that a provider is committed to remediating that non-compliance and has demonstrated a willingness to work with us, there's generally no need for us to use powers to compel action. Where we consider that a provider isn't taking their obligations seriously, or there is a history of the provider making promises that they haven't kept, we will consider taking compliance action at that point. If we did get to that point, that wouldn't come as a surprise to that provider, as we would have been talking to them about those concerns regarding their actions or lack of. Ultimately, what we're focused on is the outcomes that the obligations are designed to deliver. So we want to see that an organisation is capable of managing risks that have the potential to impact quality, safety and sustainability of care. And how we work to achieve that is very much in response to how a provider decides to work with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellie. And I might ask you a further question that's come in. This question is, I don't think I'll be able to meet the new enforceable liquidity threshold on the 1st of July 2025. What will happen to me?
Thank you. So again, we'll work with providers here. So where providers have less than the prescribed minimum liquidity amount, we'll work with them to understand if they have different strategies that will give them the financial capacity to manage risks that the liquidity standard is designed to prevent. So strategies to manage liquidity could include looking at related party arrangements, for example. In these cases, the Commission may engage with providers to seek evidence of those arrangements. If we're satisfied those arrangements are sufficiently robust to meet the minimum standard, we may consider placing a condition on providers' registration to ensure they report any changes in those arrangements. Where other strategies don't exist, we'll expect the provider to work with us to show evidence of their plan to meet the regulatory requirements of that new liquidity threshold. Where there are concerns that a provider isn't meeting its regulatory requirements, we'll contact them directly. And providers who disregard or aren't interested in managing risk and achieving compliance will be subject to compliance action. But again, we'll work closely with providers before we get to that point. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ellie. Another question I might pass to Paul. This is the question. I'm a small provider of home care services and do not have a board. How to meet the financial and prudential management standard?
Yeah, thank you, Liz. And again, thank you for the question. Look, in the case of small providers that may not have a board, responsibility falls on the individuals who control the organisation. Now, this could be a sole owner, a director, the partners, ultimately whoever it is that is ultimately responsible for the executive decisions of the organisation. And clearly it's these people who are responsible for ensuring the provider is compliant with the financial and prudential standards. So regardless of your size, all organisations should have documented systems, policies and procedures in place to ensure that all executive decision makers, management and every staff member have clearly defined responsibilities and accountabilities. So I think the answer is you have somebody responsible for your organisation regardless of the size, and they are who is responsible for ensuring the standards are met.
Thanks so much, Paul.
Thanks, Liz.
I might pass to Peter or Ellie on this one. Perhaps Ellie, how will you regulate group structures? And a related question, and this has come up a lot in the questions submitted during the webinar. How do the new reporting prudential requirements consider organisations that provide multiple service types, such as home care, retirement living, short-term restorative, private services, etc., where cash is managed at a consolidated level?
Thanks, Liz. And I might take part of that question, and Peter, I might throw to you a little bit for that related question as well. But certainly in terms of those group structures, we know that many providers operate, I guess, in a range of different structures, and we see certainly simple ones, but we know that many providers operate in quite complex corporate structures as well. And some of those with a number of related entities or within a group of multiple providers. So we often engage with providers to understand those structures and understand the unique way in which they work. But ultimately, each registered provider is required to meet all of its regulatory responsibilities. And that's regardless of whether it's a single registered provider or part of a larger group with multiple registered providers. And so I think that ties in a little bit to that related question there, Liz. I think that, providers in these types of corporate structures with related entities and multiple providers and different service types are probably specifically interested in that in relation to the liquidity standard. As I mentioned, I guess in response to one of the earlier questions, sometimes we will have a look at those related party arrangements and see what arrangements there are to manage that liquidity risk, for example, in that group structure. But ultimately, each individual registered provider is required to demonstrate that it either has meets that minimum liquidity threshold or has arrangements in place to meet that. Peter, I don't know if you wanted to add anything further there.
Yeah, look, thanks, Ellie. And this is when I sort of took over Rochelle's bit, and Rochelle does a lot of work in this space, understanding related party arrangements and how they are supporting or potentially not supporting the financial viability of the approved provider, or in the future the registered provider. So and I can understand why some of you listening in are very interested in how we'll be managing that, because you do have, and we do know this, that you do have related businesses that are not operating necessarily under the approved provider banner, or in the future the registered provider banner. But as I said in the presentation, we will, if we look at those arrangements and we can see that the registered provider has ready access to the liquidity they need, and those arrangements are suitably robust to support the registered provider to be able to do that, then you will not be of regulatory interest to us. And but because we do rely on the QF, the quarterly financial data, to sort of identify liquidity risk, we will talk to those providers about whether there might need to be a condition put in place to make sure that there's a reporting obligation if those arrangements that you have put in place via third parties change in any way. But we can talk further about this through the consultation process. But I was pleased to see that question come up a number of times, because we recognised in our preparation for this that would be an area of concern for some providers. And in saying that, we're not critical of the arrangements that some providers have in place, because they've been put in place for various reasons, and it's really about ensuring that the registered provider entity has access to the cash it needs when it needs it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Peter. Liz, just mentioned that there are lots of questions coming through, and we're probably not going to get to a number of them. So we will follow up with responses outside the webinar where we can. And I also just make the point, this is a consultation, so some of them are not so much questions as comments and concerns, and we'll take those into account in consideration of the standards. But I might go back to Ellie with the question, who is responsible to repay refundable deposits if they are loaned to, invested via, or otherwise held by a third party?
Thanks, Liz. So the regulatory requirements in relation to the repayment of refundable deposits or the permitted use of refundable deposits hasn't changed. So there's nothing different in the new standards in that regard. So refundable deposits can only be given to a third party in line with the current permitted use requirements. It's the provider's responsibility to repay any refundable deposits as they come due, regardless of what arrangements they've made there. So I think, again, that's probably particularly worth noting in relation to those providers that operate as part of a larger group and might be, consolidating investment and other arrangements like that. But ultimately, the individual registered provider is always responsible for refunding those deposits in line with the requirements of the Act. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Ellie. Further question, please confirm that a specifically established line of credit is acceptable in meeting the liquidity standard. Ellie, are you comfortable to answer that one? Or do you want Paul or Peter to jump in?
Paul, you can have a go. We haven't seen you in a minute.
Much appreciated. Thank you, Elliot. Thank you, Liz. So in relation to long credit, so under the liquidity standard, you need to hold the minimum liquidity amount at all times. Now, what we do know and what's been talked about so far is that some providers will not appear to be meeting the standard, but may not hold or pose a liquidity risk due to other arrangements. Now, this is because they have access to liquidity via arrangements like Ellie was referring to with third-party related loans. But some providers also use lines of credit to manage the timing differences between inflows and outflows of refundable deposits. Now, as we know, a line of credit is a repayable debt, so it is only a short-term fix to your liquidity. It's not a sustainable way of maintaining liquidity. But again, in these cases, the Commission will engage with you and seek evidence of your arrangements, and we will determine whether we are satisfied that those arrangements are sufficiently robust to meet the minimum liquidity amount. And in these cases, again, we may consider placing a condition on a provider's registration to ensure they report any changes to those circumstances which obviously may impact the risk position. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Paul. I might just take a couple from the input that's coming in. One question is, can the liquidity calculator take the QFR data directly from the DPMS instead of us having to do the data entry? I don't know much about this, but I think the answer to that is yes.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Liz, and thank you for the question. Yes, absolutely, that is our desired outcome, and we are working with the department at the moment around GPMS and actually having the calculator and other resources built into GPMS so that you'll be able to see at the point of data entry for your QFR where you're sitting in terms of compliance with the minimum liquidity amount. We don't have timeframes on when that may be delivered, but it is definitely something we're working on. And in the interim, we are producing tools like the minimum liquidity calculator, which is published on our website to support. And we've designed that in a way that it is compatible with the inputs of QFR returns, so it should be a very easy use case for you.
Thank you, Paul. And I might see if you can answer the following one. Is the liquidity minimum standard 35% of cash expenses monthly, quarterly, or annually?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Liz. It is a quarterly calculation. So again, to make it effective and efficient for the sector and ourselves, aligned with QFR submission, it is a 35-10 based on your quarterly input into your QFR returns. So it is basically forecasting your cash requirements for the next quarter based on the outputs from what you've inputted into QFR submissions for the prior quarter. So it is quarterly based and using a range of cash expense types that come from your inputted data in your profit and loss and your balance sheets for the financially minded people in the audience.
I might also just chip in there, Liz, if that's okay. So to put it in a very practical way, what we're sort of looking to get providers to do is to maintain sufficient cash reserves that they could cover their expected expenses for a month, right? Plus obviously 10% of their RAD holdings if that's needed. So that's the intent. And in coming up with that formula, it really is the product of a lot of analysis that we've done around various financial risk scenarios. And in arriving at the amount, we've been working hard to ensure that in setting the liquidity threshold, it doesn't inadvertently lock up capital that could be invested back into the services. So we really have tried to balance those two competing aims, so that liquidity risk is managed, but not so much cash is locked up that it prevents reasonable investment back into services, because we know that is something that the sector also requires.
Thanks so much, Peter. I must ask Ellie this question. What impact will the new standards have on registered providers' financial reporting for the current financial year?
Thanks, Liz. So reporting for the current financial year, providers will still need to report against the current standards, so financial and prudential requirements for this year. Previously, only providers that held refundable deposits were required to complete the annual prudential compliance statement. So that will only change in terms of financial reporting for the 25-26 financial reports. So those reports will be updated to reflect the new standards. And we're still in the process of preparing detailed guidance on what each different provider category will need to complete in that reporting. But certainly for the 24-25 financial year, providers will be reporting as per the current legislation and prudential standards.
And thanks, Ellie. And I might ask you another one while you're here. Will the standards include some frameworks to assist providers in meeting the expectations? Most providers use different systems, and the small specialist providers may have a smaller budget to work with to make changes, and it would be terrible to lose those providers as a result.
Thanks, Liz. Yes, so definitely we recognise that every provider is unique, and they all have different approaches, systems, and obviously resources to meet the new standards. So I'll say I think each standard lists a fairly broad set of objectives and requirements that providers need to address, and they're not prescriptive at all in the type of framework or system that a provider needs. So we recognise that all providers will need to tailor their systems and frameworks and so on to suit their specific organisation, but also the resources that they have available. And we certainly don't expect a one-size-fits-all approach. So what we'll be focused on is seeing that a provider's approach allows them to meet the requirements and outcomes of each standard. We will, of course, expect that no matter the size of the provider or their location, they should be able to develop and demonstrate that they have robust, comprehensive governance systems in place for each of the standards. And like I said earlier, we certainly see that across the sector already, providers do have, good systems and governance arrangements in place. And we will work closely with providers of any size to support them to get their frameworks and so on up to meet the new standards.
Thanks so much, Ellie. So Peter, I might ask you, what will the impact of implemented be evaluated, preferably independently, and the results published?
Yes, look, that's an excellent question, and it goes to something that the New Aged Care Act requires anyway. So under the New Aged Care Act, the Minister must initiate an independent review on the operations of the Act within 6 months of the third anniversary of the commencement of the Act. So before that review, the Commission will also be actively monitoring and engaging with the sector on each of the standards to understand the sector's understanding and also compliance with those standards. But that also gives us the opportunity to make around liquidity threshold.
We might just go to one last question, maybe for Paul. So can you please explain how the new RAD retentions will work? and what the retained funds have been used for.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Yeah, and just to be clear for everyone, RAD retention is broader government policy and obviously not the focus of our consultation today, and not direct input into our financial and prudential standards. The Department of Health and Aged Care has a range of consultation and exposure resources available on their website, and I would really encourage everyone in this session today to engage with their consultation and communication products so that you have awareness of the obligations. But ultimately, the ability to retain RADs, a proportion of RAD for a period of time, does not really have an impact on the application of these standards. We will be looking to ensure that you are operating compliance with those obligations and not retaining more than you're allowed to, but outside of the financial and prudential standards themselves.
Thanks so much, Paul. All right, I'm conscious of time. We've worked through a lot of questions there. There are a lot more I can see that have been submitted. So as I said, we will try and pick those up in our continuing communications and our Q&As, etc. And obviously, we're really keen to get your feedback. Paul, do you want to just comment on what's the time frame for people to provide feedback?
Yeah, thank you, Liz. So people would have seen the QR code and the ability to access our consultation resources, but also our feedback processes. So please grab your phones, scan the QR code, bookmark and make it a favourite our consultation page, because that will be our portal for updating information to you. But our consultation period has opened as of today and runs until the 7th of March. So we really value and appreciate your input. And I do encourage you to access, but also there is contact us resources. So if you have other queries, please reach out. There's an email inbox specifically for this purpose, which we will monitor and respond to your queries.
Thanks so much, Paul. All right, I want to say thank you very much to the team, and thanks to all of you for participating. Hope you found the session informative and helpful. And as Paul said, we've launched the public consultation on the standards, and you can find all the information on our website about that, or on if you use the QR code. And we really do want your feedback, and we value that. A recording of today's webinar will be published on our website in the next couple of days, and everyone who registered for today's session will be sent a link to the recording as soon as it's available. Finally, we have a brief feedback survey on your screen immediately after this webinar. Your feedback's really important to us as we map out the webinar schedule for 2025. So please take 2 minutes to share your thoughts if you can. Until next time, thanks for joining us today.